I am not happy. Honestly, if I'm being for real with you guys, I think this might be one of the most embarrassing things any American government official has said. And when I say any, I mean working with the Biden admin or working under the Biden admin in some capacity. Because obviously we can go to Marjorie Taylor Greene and we can find something that's more embarrassing than anything anyone else has said combined. But when we're talking about the Biden admin, this is probably one of the most embarrassing statements to come for somebody that is currently working in the Biden government. Check this out. And this is somebody who works under Secretary of State Lloyd Austin, mind you.
When the Ukrainians hit Russia's oil and gas infrastructure, the Biden administration came out and condemned the Ukrainians for hitting Russia's oil and gas infrastructure and suggested that they should not do that again. Can you tell me why, while Russia is attacking Ukrainians' oil and gas and energy sector, why shouldn't the Ukrainians attack the Russian oil and gas and energy sector?
The issue on attacking critical infrastructure is when those are civilian targets, we have concerns because Ukraine holds itself to the highest standards of observing the laws of armed conflict, and that's one of the elements of being a European democracy.
But the Russians are attacking the oil and gas infrastructure in Ukraine, correct?
Absolutely.
And if you're going to win a war, you can't sit back and take punches and not deliver punches. So why shouldn't the Ukrainians attack the oil and gas infrastructure in Russia?
Congressman, we have concerns about striking at civilian targets when we support countries. Again, this is Ukraine's sovereign decision, but we express those concerns.
But those oil and gas infrastructures in Russia are owned by the Kremlin, correct? It's not like they're owned by a private corporation that have shareholders and private assets are being destroyed.
They are owned by private Russian citizens who are part of the Putin regime. That is correct.
I mean, it makes sense to me that we should destroy them.
I think Congressman Whitman honestly could have pressured that a lot harder, and I'm a little surprised he didn't grill her a little harder there. I think there's a lot of areas you could have gone more aggressive on this. But let's acknowledge how baffling this is. We just had a U.S. government official that is working in our foreign policy establishment, that's a high-ranking official called before Congress to testify under oath, and they just said that Russian oil infrastructure, refineries, so these are refineries meant to produce higher quality goods, that Russian oil and gas corporations, as she said, tied to the Putin regime, makes money, and then that money is then put into the war machine and then used to bomb Ukraine. And this is all while Russia is bombing Ukrainian oil, gas, energy plants, power plants, energy infrastructure, electricity, in order to take it out. I think they've destroyed like 80% of Ukraine's hydroelectric plants. They just bombed, I think, earlier today, and it's been critiqued by others that it isn't getting enough coverage. They just bombed another thermal power station in Kiev this morning. And I saw Jimmy Rushton was criticizing the fact that even though it was blown up just this morning, it's gotten barely any attention in the press. Russia's destruction of one of the largest thermal power plants in Ukraine, just outside of Kiev, doesn't even feature on the BBC's website, which is still one of the most popular ways for Brits to get news. Their top story, the Indian men traumatized by fighting for Russia. I just want to say, just very, very quickly, if this is state-associated and state-owned, and the profits are being used to fund the war, not only fund the war financially, but also supply the army with oil and natural gas products so they can supply their tanks, their trucks, their cars, and their trains, and all of their transportation, their boats, their planes to bomb Ukraine. How can we say that what is supplying their planes to bomb Ukrainian cities is not part of the military, is not a legitimate target? And look, this is, I think, obvious to anyone who heard this. Like, really? Like, bombing their oil and gas is, we're not going to consider that a legitimate military target? And I'm not the only person pointing this out. There are a lot of people pointing this out. I'm just a person on the internet pointing this out. Here is the Lithuanian foreign minister pointing it out. But he points it out not directly, indirectly. In World War II, the Allies bombed Nazi Germany's oil depots as a high priority military target. That's the tweet. And when I say that's the tweet, I mean he wrote at the end, that's the tweet, not me saying that is the tweet, but it is also the tweet. Why do you think FDR wasn't concerned about Germany's oil supply being cut off, hurting international oil markets? Well, on one hand, it was probably because at that point, Germany's oil markets were solely and focused on one goal, and that was keeping the war machine afloat. And they weren't really selling much in the international scene, so it couldn't affect it much. But on a much broader point, and the much bigger point, is because they were trying to win a war. And since they were trying to win a war, when Germany's goal was the annihilation of America's allies and the destruction of America's allies, and eventually, if the Japanese chemical weapons and terror plans to try to use diseased mosquitoes to kill millions of Americans are to be believed, also possibly try to annihilate the United States if they get the chance. Not that they would probably ever get the chance due to many unchangeable facts of history, including geography. But it's clear from historical precedent, it's clear that oil depots, that refineries, that this type of infrastructure, which both finances the war and directly supplies the tanks, planes, trains, trucks, everything necessary to fight the war, can be considered a legitimate military target. These are not owned by private, far-off corporations not tied to the war. These are not owned by individuals not tied to the regime that made the decision to invade the war. Russia's economy is built around the oil and natural gas sector. And that means that the oil and natural gas sector also supplies the war effort through oil and natural gas and financing. If you build everything around it, it's not Ukraine or the world's fault that once they start targeting what's supplying and helping the war effort, including that sector, that Russia doesn't have much else to fall back upon economically. It is not the rest of the world's fault that Russia's tech sector is not booming right now. It is not the rest of the world's fault that Russia's sectors, when it comes to, high amounts of service goods or education or whatever it is not booming and ready to replace it. The only sector that has risen to challenge oil and natural gas is the military and military industries. But that doesn't mean that they're supplying the rest of the world. That just means it's taking up a bigger and bigger percentage of Russian GDP, Russian expenses for supplying the war effort. Because if you actually look at Russian munitions exports, Russian military weapons exports, arms sales, I think in, 2012, they were at 30% of the world market of weapon sales. As of 2022, 2023, I think they're down to 4%. Now, much of that decline was before the war, but even more of that decline was after the war because all they can do now is really fulfill previous contracts because they're not signing any contracts in the near future when they have no clue where this is going. And they're burning 30 to 40% of the Soviet era tank fleet in Ukrainian fields. They're a little distracted right now. But again, it's not the rest of the world's fault that Russia built their economy around this. And also the centerpiece of that economy is also part of the centerpiece of what is supplying the war economy as well. It is not the rest of the world's a fault that this is the case, and it's not the rest of the world's job to protect the Russian economy in this way, or to protect this Russian energy sector in this way. It's baffling to have an American official just say that in Congress, under oath, responding to a congressman. It really is baffling to me. I do want to say it wasn't just baffling to me. It was also baffling to some Russian commentators. This is a small, and I do want to note small, 34,000 subscribers on Telegram. That's Igor Girkin's face, by the way, who is currently in a Russian prison for being too critical of the government, not because he was saying stop the war, because he said bomb them harder, and he was critical of Putin while saying bomb them harder, and he got arrested for it, even though he was one of Putin's militia FSB foot soldiers in the war of Ukraine for years and years and years. This account also thought it was baffling, and they used it as an example of America's decline. Let's read the translation from this pro-Russia account. Let's think about the situation in general. Of course, Vladimir Putin's team, having missed the chance of 2014, since 2022 has caught the West at the time of its severe internal crisis. Here you have a growing split within the core of the capital system, the USA fraught with turmoil. The difference in vision of the future of America between Trumpists and Democrats is much greater than between the North and the South in 1861. Okay. So let's be clear. The guy's a little deluded. The idea that the North and the South were less divided than Americans and Trumpists are now, I think, is a little bizarre. It kind of ignores things like bleeding Kansas. All of this is dependent upon no knowledge of American history, but whatever. Continue. It's like the Civil War did not just happen. It did not just fall into the sky. There was an increasing amounts of violence that increased for years and years and years, and then culminated after the election of President Lincoln and an American military fort being bombed by local state troops. Anyway, continuing. The decline of the transatlantic imperial republic is an event. It is clear that, for the sake of the internal struggle, they are ready to stop military assistance to Kiev and give victory to the Russian Federation, thus literally bringing down the status of the United States as a global hegemon. From the same category are the calls of the State Department and the American Defense Ministry to Kiev. Stop hitting Russian oil refineries with drones, because this, they say, will unbalance the global oil markets. Find, supposedly, goals that are more adequate to its military tasks. This is the clearest example of the decline of Washington, for the destruction of refineries and synthetic fuel plants have always been the primary goals of the Yankees since the advent of long-range weapons. This has been the case since the era of flying fortresses. This continues in the days of cruise missiles and drones, for there is no better way to immobilize the enemy with minimal losses than to deprive him of fuel. The argumentation of the current Washington is so ridiculous that all that can remain is to twist your finger to your temple. The destruction of Russian refineries, on the contrary, will increase the supply of crude oil from it to the world market, bringing down the price. This is why it is extremely important for us to protect our refineries. But Washington is talking wild nonsense, confirming its decline. Add all this to the lack of will and deindustrialization of the EU. By the way, when it comes to military industry, these things are industrializing more. There's certain sectors of the economy, both in the United States and in Europe, that have deindustrialized and been replaced largely with service economies. But in other industries, that's not the case. For example, in chip manufacturing, in Arizona, we have a new microchip manufacturing plant opening next year. Then another one from the main Taiwanese manufacturing company in 2028. And then another one in 2030. They increased their recent investment, they announced this recently, from $45 billion to $65 billion. Now, to be clear, that's also in part, not the one that's opening next year, but definitely the one opening in 2028 and 2030 because of the CHIPS Act, which offered these companies, I think it was $5.5 billion in loans and $6.6 billion in subsidies to get that here, because we considered having those chips in the United States not only favorable for having people employed here, we want short supply lines, but a national security priority, since it's not only needed for computers and phones, but also needed for things like drones, long-range missiles, etc. That's something that the Russians are finding out right now as they try to find substitutes for their chips, as they're trying to get it from other places. But like deindustrialization, there's some areas that have been deindustrialized, obviously. It's just that in other areas we are reindustrializing. To the military weakness of Britain, to the clear reluctance of Westerners to directly confront the Russian Federation in war. And here is a picture of the clear success of Vladimir Putin's team in the field. Okay, let's be clear. Both the Russians and the Americans and everyone does not want to fight each other directly in a war due to the threat it could cause of an international, war, World War III. No matter how difficult the MK treats the current government, one must be fair. But here's the damned question. Can Moscow really take advantage of the weakness of America and the EU? Here, the picture is not so beautiful. Let's talk about this further. Okay, but we don't need to talk about that. We just wanted to talk about his opinion of Washington. So the Russians think that targeting oil and natural gas is perfectly fine within military doctrine, and you can do it with minimal losses. And Russian online commentators seem to be scratching their head at us pressuring the Ukrainians in this way. And so I do have to say, how can you expect the Ukrainians to listen to us on this issue if not only the Russians are scratching their head at it and they're willing to do it 10 times over to the Ukrainians and go further and target their thermal electric plants, electrical grids, etc. And not only is this a problem when it comes to, the Russians targeting them, but the Russians are also baffled by it. Many European countries, like the Lithuanians, are baffled by it. But the West has also, specifically the United States, in Europe, it's a different question. The United States has started to cut off aid to Ukraine. Not officially, but that aid has been cut off for 6 months. The last aid package was literally the equivalent of the United States digging through the couch cushions to see what was available. It was $300 million. And to be clear, that same month, Denmark sent a larger aid package to the Ukrainians. This month, more aid was sent to Ukraine from Serbia than the United States. Let me say that again. This month, more aid was sent from Serbia to Ukraine than the United States. Why would the Ukrainians listen to us about not targeting these oil refineries? If the Russians think it's weird that they would, if much of Europe think it's weird that they would, the Ukrainians believe, and they have good reason to believe, that they're fighting an existential struggle of survival, knowing that the Russian economy is built around oil and natural gas supplies and refineries. And we're done sending aid to them, at least for now, until something gets approved. Mike Johnson finds the way to get out of the corner that he's boxed himself into. How can we expect them to listen to us at all on this? In fact, there are some American officials who don't think they should listen to us at all on this. Some of them in the Biden admin. This is from Oliver Carroll. Not everyone in the U.S. government is on board. I've been speaking to some people here in Kiev involved in the long-range program. They say the U.S. contacts are winking while warning. They're privately telling us to keep going. I've heard a few people say that what could be happening is that the Biden administration is publicly saying, don't do this, but privately, they don't really care that much. Now, this is impossible to figure out. And I do want to throw out there that, we could try to craft scenarios that sound better to us in their heads or worse to us in our heads. But all of this is inevitably going to end up being speculation until we have the archival documents, probably decades after this war is done. But, I think another possibility is this is a legitimate divide in the U.S. administration. We know Jake Sullivan and Anthony Blinken have been at odds about whether to support Ukraine with, for example, the fighter jet transfer with Poland at the start of the war. We've been given good indication that Anthony Blinken, who is the current, Secretary of State of the United States government. Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, get it confused sometimes. He's the Secretary of State, and he wanted to go forward with the deal, but we didn't end up doing that. And a lot of people believe that's because National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and others were not as enthused about the idea due to what they saw it as the risk of escalation. Now, post facto, we can see that sending over jets to Ukraine is not something that escalates into World War III, because now multiple countries have approved jets to Ukraine. The Greeks are thinking about sending, I think, some more jets to Ukraine, or F-16s over to Ukraine, or doing some deals. And it hasn't started World War III. But they would make the argument that you got to slowly probe up to make it so there isn't any big jump that the Russians can use at that point to say, it's time to escalate. And by slowly doing it and not having a clear cutoff point, it's kind of hard for them to find a point to escalate over. But at the end of the day, after the fact, those jet shipments are not going to lead to World War III. I think this could be a real divide within the U.S. government. And if the U.S. government is divided over it and the U.S. government isn't sending aid to Ukraine, why should the Ukrainians listen to us? I don't think they're going to listen to us. You should probably expect more Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil refineries in the near future. And if anything, I think there has to be a question of, if it gets bad enough and we're not sending anything, what if the Ukrainians just start blowing up the Russian oil export terminals? And if that happens, then you're really going to see a problem, and you're really going to see an energy crisis. And if we're not sending them any aid, how do we have any leverage to stop them?